My name is Ken Levinson. I'm the Executive Director of WITA. Thanks all to you for coming. Thanks to our panelists. This is our first program of the fall, first public program. We had an intensive trade seminar event last week with GW University, and that was actually, if anyone listens to the Trade Guys podcast from CSIS, they actually recorded at our event last week, which was a fun thing. There's a couple of people here in the room today who were at that event. Thrilled to have you all back here today. When we were wrapping up our summer programming and our annual dinner, we were thinking NAFTA might be one of the first things that we'd address. We didn't know where that process would be, and when we even set this event, we knew that the negotiations were ongoing. We didn't know when it would close, and we said to our speakers, we're not sure where it'll be, but we know it'll be somewhere. So we are in that place right now. We're still figuring out a lot of what's there. The WITA fall programming is still in formation. We have a big event next week. We'll be looking at trade and national security, things like CFIUS, investment, sanctions. We have an all-star panel. It's a big event. We'll be doing it up in the rotunda in this building also. That's on Tuesday, pink sheet that you could have gotten on the way out. We have a thing we'll be doing later in October, early November, called the Registrar, with a group called Registrar at FDA Boot Camp, learning about how the FDA makes regulations and enforces them on foods and drugs. And then the big thing I want to flag for everybody to mark on your calendars is on January 29th next year, on Tuesday, we're going to have an all-day conference to look at all the different trade policy issues that are on the table. We're going to have general plenaries and breakout sessions, and there should be something for everybody. We hope it becomes a big annual event on the trade calendar. So mark your calendars, January 29th. More information on that to follow. Thanks again to our panelists for joining us today. It's a really terrific group of people. Matt Gold, who's joined us for some of these other NAFTA events. We had one, I think it was just about a year ago. It was last fall that he joined us for one. Celeste Drake with the AFL-CIO, thank you for joining us. Laura Dawson with the Canada Institute at the Wilson Center, and Ambassador SARUKHAN, thank you all for joining us. We'll have time, the panelists will give brief presentations, and as our standard WITA practice, after they're done and a discussion among them, we'll open it up for questions from the audience. With that, Matt?
Thanks, Ken. So where are we now? It's been a very interesting year, to say the least, and we're here today to take a look at exactly where things are and where we are with the NAFTA renegotiation. On the day President Trump took office, where were we then? At that point, we had finished 8 years of negotiating the TPP, and Mexico and Canada and the United States were all parties. And the terms of trade in North America were about to be updated by the much more modern provisions of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, FTA. Of course, we all know that on his first full business day in office, President Trump withdrew the United States from the TPP, not even beginning to comprehend the implications of that move. And among the many implications of that move was the fact that our ability to update the terms of trade among the United States, Canada, and Mexico that was arising out of the TPP negotiations was gone. So suddenly we had a need to go back to the then 23-year-old NAFTA and start negotiating updates to that agreement directly. At the same time, the need to update NAFTA collided with President Trump's political agenda. He'd just come off the campaign trail as a populist. He had just finished telling his constituents anything he thought they wanted to hear, including the idea that many of their economic problems were caused by NAFTA, had been caused by NAFTA. And so President Trump had a compelling need to deliver a lot more than just simply some updates to NAFTA. He had a need to deliver on a campaign promise, which was to overhaul NAFTA to the point that it was going to change the economy around his constituents or pull out of it. Of course, that wasn't an easy thing to do because NAFTA was never that broken and could never be updated to that degree, but this was something that President Trump needed to either do or make it appear as if he'd done. So we went into a NAFTA renegotiation with two categories of issues to talk about. One was updating the agreement in a myriad of ways. For digital commerce, the sanitary and phytosanitary measures and technical barriers to trade rules, telecom rules, bring labor and environment into the main agreement, make them enforceable, fix some problems with Chapter 20, a whole series of updates. And then we also went in with a series of bigger demands that would involve much more substantial concessions on the other side. Things like what President Trump wanted with Buy America, which was essentially that the government procurement rules would continue to apply to Canada and Mexico and just not apply to the United States. A U.S. content requirement to the automotive rules of origin, which is completely inconsistent with the concept of a multilateral or a trilateral free trade agreement. The 5-year sunset provision, which is something that would just render a free trade agreement useless, which is why no free trade agreement in the world ever had one. And then eliminating both Chapter 19 and the Canadian tariff rate quotas on American poultry, eggs, and traditional dairy products, both of which were actually reasonable, but the United States did not even come close to having the leverage to force Canada to agree to either of those. We simply had nothing to offer Canada that would make it politically feasible for Canada to agree to either of those two things. So we had that second list of things which were either anomalous for free trade agreements or just not achievable. And so they were bundled together with all the updates in this attempt at renegotiating NAFTA. President Trump probably could have gotten Mexico and Canada to the negotiating table without kicking and screaming and without threatening to withdraw from NAFTA if he had stuck to just the updates. But by adding that other list, it became much more contentious, and he did have to drag Canada and Mexico to the table kicking and screaming. He had to threaten to withdraw from NAFTA multiple times. Of course, along with that came all the damage to the U.S. economy, Canadian and Mexican economy because of uncertainty and panic, as well as damage to our relations with both countries. And now we're at a point where we're getting closer to see what, if anything, we got out of all of that. At the end of the day, to the degree we get a series of meaningful updates, which apparently we're going to get, it's not clear any of that drama or that damage was necessary to achieve those things. With regard to the other list, that list of things I gave you a moment ago that required all the drama, it's not clear if the United States is going to get any of them except part of one, which is the changes to the North American content requirement of the automotive rules of origin. So it does look like we're going to get an agreement with a lot of updates, although there's still a lot of talk with Canada about it. But it doesn't look like we're going to get any of those contentious issues that caused the drama. It looks right now like we're not getting that kind of change to the rules of to the procurement rules. We definitely have given up on the U.S. content requirement, the rules of origin. We've given up on the sunset provision. Yes, it's true Mexico agreed to a 16-year sunset, but what that says to me is that Mexico agreed to be the bad guy to say no to the 5-year sunset, the 10-year sunset, and the 15-year sunset. And then Mexico has said to Canada, okay, you're going to have to say no to the 16-year and beyond, but don't think that Mexico not saying no to a 16-year sunset means there's going to be a sunset. It just means Canada is going to say no to the rest. And finally, Chapter 19, the TRQs, we don't have the answer yet, but really we do have the answer. I mean, if you ask me, I sat in the stage a year and a half ago and said, no chance Canada would give in on Chapter 19 if we didn't have a softwood lumber agreement. And I said no chance Canada would give in on the TRQs, except maybe to this very small degree they did in TPP. And I think that Canada's maintained that position all this time since, and I think that's still their position. In other words, I think we've already got that answer. But we'll find out whether I'm right or wrong. Our panelists here today are all quite distinguished and all have views that I'm very interested in hearing. We're going to begin with Ambassador ARTURO SARUKHAN, former Mexican ambassador to the United States, who's now at the Brookings Institute. His very impressive biography is here in your program, and I'm going to hand it over to Ambassador SARUKHAN.
Specific question or just blurt out initial ideas?
We'd like to hear your few-minute view on where we are right now and where you think we're going.
Good morning, and thank you for the invitation to join you today. It's a big pleasure to be with two good colleagues with whom over the years we have been discussing and mulling and chewing on many of these issues which are still out there. The greatest challenge that we have is that we don't know what we don't know, and we don't have a text. We don't have black and white language for what Mexico and the United States announced that they had reached a compromise on 3 weeks ago. We certainly don't have a text on those issues which Canada, the US, and Mexico had been able to hammer out, those 9 or 10 chapters that had been closed previous to the breaking out of bilateral conversations with Canadians and the Mexicans. And we probably won't have a clear sense of what's in there until the administration submits to Congress a text 60 days before the do or die date, which has been sort of artificially imposed first by Mexico and then the White House, which assumed Mexico's own deadline of November 30th so that the outgoing administration could sign the agreement. There's a bit of an urban legend out there, because if you read some of the press and you see some of the analysis, sort of the byline is Mexico wants to sign this before López Obrador comes into office because they don't want López Obrador reopening what has already been negotiated. It's actually both the incoming and the outgoing Mexican administrations that want to have this done by December 1st. The outgoing Mexican administration, for obvious reasons, because they want to be able to claim that they were able to save NAFTA, able to renegotiate this issue with President Trump. Remember, this administration was caught in a crossfire of Mexican public opinion as a result of then candidate Trump's trip to Mexico during the general campaign, and then the subsequent Mexico bashing and the anti-Mexico tirades of President Trump, which really put this Mexican administration into a corner. So there was a deep desire by the outgoing administration to be able to say, you know, we were the adults in the room, we were able to save and deliver a negotiation with NAFTA. But the incoming administration, I think, they haven't articulated this in any public way or form, but the Mexican incoming administration clearly, and President-elect López Obrador clearly, has decided one thing: he does not want to pick a fight with Donald Trump, and he is bending backwards to avoid a food fight with this president. So therefore, he asked President Peña Nieto, please wrap up the negotiation so I don't have to deal with the negotiation per se as of December 1st. So that's one first piece that I think is important that we put out for pasture. The second one is the whole debate that has been triggered and which Laura and I and others have sort of witnessed on social media as a result of the Mexico-US bilateral agreement that Mexico somehow threw Canada on the bus or stabbed Canada in the back. I would disagree with that characterization. I am one of those who has articulated publicly throughout the process that I think a bad deal is worse than no deal at all. We can debate in a bit whether what we have right now is a bad deal or not, which I think a lot of you will want us to discuss, because I do have concerns in particular regarding the automotive rules of origin and what that might do to North American competitiveness in the auto sector going forward vis-a-vis China and India and Asia, where that's where we need to be thinking of exporting and not into the North American market, and we can discuss that in a bit. But what is clear is that going back to this whole discussion of, has Mexico stabbed Canada? Mexico needed to solve, I wouldn't say purely, but bilateral sticking issues that were germane to the US-Mexico discussions in the same way that Canada had to deal with bilateral issues with the US, softwood lumber, dairy, Chapter 19, that were either non-relevant to Mexico or were really not salient for the Mexican-US agenda. So Mexico needed to have sort of a side room discussion with the United States, in particular regarding rules of origin, because of some of the implications on wages and some of the language that appears to have been put into the agreement between Mexico and the United States as to percentages of production pegged to a wage increase in certain areas of Mexico, which we can discuss in a bit. And there was also, I think, a different political timetable for Mexico, given the incoming and outgoing government's decision to have this done signed by December the 1st, the Canadian government had another domestic political timetable. So there was a bit of a disconnect between how Mexicans and Canadians saw the clock moving forward. And then, you know, as someone who's been looking at the North American relationship for 20 plus years and who had the huge pleasure to, during my 6 years as ambassador, to engage with two formidable and dear friends as Canadian ambassadors, Mike Wilson, who was one of the original NAFTA negotiators, and then Gary Dewar. Whenever, and especially with Gary Dewar, when we were negotiating Mexico and the United States accession to TPP with the Obama administration, we would do a lot of this together, and I would always joke that Mexico and Canada had one thing in common, and that we both lived next to an elephant, but it was much better to be above the elephant, on top of the elephant, than underneath the elephant. This is to point out that from the get-go, when a year and a half ago, the whole debate over renegotiation of NAFTA started when the Trump administration came into office, there were voices, not only in Canadian opposition, but even in the current Canadian government, that at the beginning started saying, well, because the relationship with Mexico at that time was similar to what you now have in terms of vitriol and character assassination between Trudeau and Trump, it was very similar to Mexico at the time. And so there were a lot of Canadians, both in and outside government, saying, we really don't mind if the Mexicans pull out, if relations with Mexico collapse. Canada and the US can do a bilateral deal. So there's a bit of a karma here, because, in fact, I was telling Laura that right at the beginning of the renegotiation, I was at a panel with former Speaker Newt Gingrich and former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, talking about the NAFTA, the looming NAFTA negotiations. And we were right at the point where there was this debate in Canada, where the current Canadian government has said, well, you know, we have a bilateral, we can fall back to that, we can negotiate bilaterally stuff, and some of us started raising our hands and say, you want to negotiate bilaterally, then you have to denounce NAFTA first. And then sort of the Canadian government started backtracking. But we were in the midst of this panel, and Stephen Harper was to my right and my left, I don't remember. He'd say, my right. I mentioned that we in Mexico were concerned that there could be temptations in Canada to throw Mexico under the bus. Harper stayed quiet, and once the panel was over and we get up, he looks at me and says, we don't need to throw you under the bus, you're going to get hit by the bus. Which sort of gave you a sense as to how Canadians were thinking of the roadmap ahead in terms of negotiation. So a second issue that I think is important that we put to rest. And we can go deeper into this. I see some very important positives, and I see some important concerns as to what we seem to have so far as a result both of the trilateral stage of negotiations and the 5 weeks of Mexico-US bilats, and what we have as of today with the Canadian-US bilat. We will have an important improvement in terms of language that was originally paradoxically in TPP, which has been bled into the treaty in terms of data protection, IPR, e-commerce. Mexico is now accepted to go up from a $50 de minimis for e-commerce to $100 de minimis. Canada still has a $25 threshold. We'll see if in these ongoing negotiations they move closer to a region where Mexico is now at, but certainly the new disciplines that did not exist when NAFTA was negotiated 20 plus years ago, and which were going to be there, to your point, which were going to be there automatically because of Mexico, Canada, and the United States accession to TPP, and would have not needed this rigmarole of negotiation. The beauty of TPP is that it would have pulled up the NAFTA into the 21st century by the bootstrings, simply because the three countries would have had to modernize their trilateral agreement to what was in TPP. So there are a lot of these new disciplines which have been incorporated into the new NAFTA, which I think is an extremely positive story. Where are my concerns, at least given the text that we have now? The first one is that despite the fact that we've moved away from a 5-year sunset clause with an automatic trigger, which is what the Trump administration demanded in its my way or the highway approach to the negotiations when this started. We now have 16 years. We'll see what happens with Canada, because this was clearly one of the issues that Mexico and the United States discussed and agreed to 3 weeks ago, which was not Mexico and the US. It was a truly trilateral issue, and somehow there I think Mexico sort of exceeded the box of purely bilateral stuff that it needed to hammer out with the United States. The good news is that A, it's longer. There isn't an automatic sundown death as a result of the sunset clause, but it's still a bad thing. It's a bad idea to have sunset clauses. I think it makes a lot of sense if the sunset clause is retinkered to provide the three governments a mechanism to periodically ensure that the agreement is working the way that it should be working. In many ways, I think one of the faults of NAFTA in the origin of how it was negotiated is that it had no mechanism to force the three countries to ensure that the treaty was up to date. The fact that we didn't have so many new disciplines that did, when NAFTA was negotiated back in 1993, there was no Amazon, there was no eBay, and so the whole issue of e-commerce wasn't even contemplated in the agreement. So I think it does make sense to ensure that there's a revision mechanism, but not anything that would trigger an automatic death process for the agreement. The other issue which I'm very concerned about has to do with the dispute resolution, which is a huge issue for this administration, and the more important one and pressing one, and we can go, and I'll stop here, is the rules of origin, because at a moment where the US purchases of cars this year was about $17 billion. In 2005, it was $17 billion. In 2000, it was $17 billion. What I'm saying is the market for cars in the United States is flat, if not decreasing. In a system that is being devised because of Trump's mercantilist obsession with trade deficit and with manufacturing, what Mexico and the United States have agreed to in terms of rules of origin and the quotas and the side letter, what it could end up doing is breaking down the integrated supply and production chains in North America that would allow the North American auto parts and auto sector to be competitive vis-a-vis Asia and in Asia. So it could be an own goal that we have allowed ourselves to score, even though, I guess, the automotive sectors are more or less okay with the language that is being negotiated by Mexico and the United States. And we can discuss this issue in further depth, but I'll stop here.
Well, thank you very much. I always feel I have to point out when it comes to the Canadian de minimis that those are, to add insult to injury, those are Canadian dollars. And we'll talk about the existing review mechanism in NAFTA but in a few minutes. But I want to go to Laura Dawson, who is the director of the Canada Institute at the Wilson Center. And we're all very excited to hear what you have to say about all of this.
Thanks, Matt. It's daunting to be here. I'm a big fan of the work of Washington International Trade Association, and I talk a lot about NAFTA, I talk a lot about trade, but usually not to an audience who actually knows what I'm talking about. Usually I get to make stuff up, so thanks. I run the Canada Institute. Previous to that, though, I was a mole in Canada. I worked for the U.S. Embassy on the as a Canadian, so I was on the team that helped keep Canada out of the TPP. You're welcome. And I've worked with the Canadian negotiators as well. So I go back and forth, friend to all. And so that's where my comments are coming from today. Anything I get wrong is entirely my own fault. In 25 years of watching, participating in trade negotiations, I've never seen a more politicized situation than we have with the NAFTA. It is extraordinary. Having had the president, usually presidents shut up about trade after they get elected. This one did not. And so what we see is sometimes a process resembles what we expect in trade negotiations, and that's hardworking negotiators talking about exciting things like pesticide residue. And sometimes it's on the front page of the Wall Street Journal and the president's tweets and the president's daughter and the Prime Minister of Canada and oh my gosh. So we've had a number of times over the last year, 14 months, where there have been clusters of politicians in town, and the media's called me up and said, is it over yet? Is it over yet? I said, no, just because you have politicians clustering like seagulls at the Winter Building does not mean it's over. 32 chapters, we're only through, 7, 8, 10, 12. Now we're finally at a point where I think there is a runway in sight, as long as the sort of, now what we've taken as a baseline level of political drama doesn't extend into some extraordinary things that we haven't seen before. I think the political impetus in this negotiations, and indeed in all negotiations, it's a bit like nitroglycerin in mining. A little bit of nitroglycerin clears the way, gives you momentum, gets things done, and a lot just blows everything to hell. So we've had a great deal of nitro in this process. One of the interesting challenges has been Canada's economic position is very similar to a sort of boilerplate U.S. Chamber of Commerce position. Relatively high wage manufacturing. We want modernization. We want North American competitiveness, etc. But politically, the Trudeau government has wanted to align more with Mexico for all sorts of reasons. Prime Minister Harper screwed up the relationship with Mexico, and it just and it just made sense in the context of the political drama that stick together or fall apart. So Canada's been kind of doing a little dance, between its economic interests, which are more aligned with a liberalizing U.S. business perspective, and the politics of staying with Mexico. And they've also recognized the fact that really they're negotiating with a bifurcated, maybe trifurcated, is that even a word, United States, where we have a White House USTR position that is straight out of some new fiction with the Sunset Clause, many of the other things that Matt and Arturo have already talked about, and then the things that we expect to see, better IP, modernization, digital, et cetera, et cetera. So Canada's sort of been stuck trying to figure out how much sort of orthodox trade modernization should they defend, and how much should they just leave for Congress to push back on and say, no, we're not willing to accept a deal that doesn't include ISDS. I mean, why would Canada and Mexico be carrying the flag on investor state dispute settlement when the United States has never lost a case? Shouldn't that be something that the U.S. Is interested in? In this case, not so much. We're in the twilight zone. So Canada's really had to decide sort of how much orthodox trade liberalization it's wanted to promote, defend, and how much it's wanted to focus on its own uniquely Canadian issues, some of which it really does want to defend, and some things it would be just as happy to get rid of, but they would rather somebody else makes them get rid of it than doing it as a domestic reform. Can you say dairy?